This isn't to pass judgment on whether or not people like or don't like pornography. That's an ethical discussion, and it's a moral discussion that has to be decided for each individual by virtue of age, etc. This is a serious concern. The discussion is happening now. I always say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a video is worth 10 million pictures. Video, and in particular action that gets us in a kind of a primitive mode, that is an extremely alluring visual image. I mean, this is the reason why we're so drawn to things like Instagram scrolling. It's like text, video, or the enormous popularity of TikTok. It's video. So yes, indeed, many people are addicted to pornography. And yes, indeed, many people who regularly indulge in pornography experience challenges in real-world romantic interactions. Fear of being discovered and the shame that they have around their obsessions and compulsions. Along the lines of how dopamine and dopamine schedules and our perception of things can shape the way that we experience things as pleasurable or not. There are beautiful studies mainly looking at sugar appetite and our sense of pleasure from sweet things. And essentially the results that come out of this are the following. If you ingest something that you like, it tastes good to you, but then you ingest something that's even sweeter or even more savory, and then you go back to the food that you ate previously, well, you don't like it as much. How much dopamine is in our system at any one time compared to how much dopamine was in our system a few minutes ago, and how much we remember enjoying a particular experience of the past, that dictates your so-called quality of life and your desire to pursue things. Dopamine is perhaps one of the most powerful molecules that any of us has inside of us, and the one that we ought to all think very carefully about how we leverage. Try removing multiple sources of dopamine release, or what used to be multiple sources of dopamine release, from activities that you want to continue to enjoy or that you want to enjoy more. How much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. This is why when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for enjoyment goes up and up and up. That's what we call addiction. When somebody pursues a drug or an activity that leads to huge increases in dopamine, it should become obvious why things like pornography, not just the accessibility of pornography, but the intensity of pornography, can negatively shape real-world romantic and sexual interactions. That's mostly about people's orientation toward attachment. People form these associations, whether or not through experience or through indirect experience, observing others. But then what happens is it doesn't have that same fulfilling aspect to it. And it tends to remove the excitement and the pleasure of the very activities that we are engaged in. Any activity that evokes a lot of dopamine release will make it harder to achieve the same level, and certainly the greater level of dopamine through a subsequent interaction. And so this really speaks to these peaks and valleys in dopamine that I mentioned before, and how your experience of anything is going to depend on your prior experience of other things that evoke dopamine. The most important thing is to understand are that these dopamine pathways really are under your control, so that you can modulate and adjust your levels of dopamine in the ways that serve you best. But there's a common path to the treatment and recovery from essentially all addictions. And there's a deep, deep satisfaction that comes from understanding, okay, there wasn't anything wrong with me or what I was doing or anything at all. It was just there was something wrong with the approach I was taking, which was layering in all these sources of dopamine and dropping my baseline. Dopamine is this universal currency. It establishes value based on not just what you're experiencing in the moment, but what you experienced in the days and minutes before. What ends up happening is the amount of dopamine that's released over time goes down and down and down and down. And then people, again, are back to this thing where, they're scrolling internet porn 8, 9, 10 times or hours a day, and then they're wondering why this isn't effective for them anymore, whereas it was before. So you can imagine that these dopamine circuits can be used to more successfully navigate a number of different things. I'm not trying to say that all pornography is bad, but there are good data to support the idea. And there's an additional issue with pornography, which is not often discussed, which is that the brain is a learning prediction machine. If your brain learns to be aroused by watching other people have sex, it is not necessarily going to carry over to the ability to get aroused when you're one-on-one with somebody else, right? Many people who become addicted to things have this feeling that normal life isn't interesting enough, that they are seeking a supernormal experience, and that the day-to-day routine, balance, the word balance itself can sometimes be a bit of an aversive term for people. And here I'm approaching this only through the lens of biology. But the idea here is that, I'm not saying pornography as a stimulus is bad or good. What I'm saying is it, in its availability and its extreme forms, it's a very potent stimulus, and very potent stimuli of any kind. Those set a threshold for dopamine release. The higher the dopamine peak, the bigger the drop afterwards. And it's not that you drop to baseline, you drop below baseline. When people are pursuing dopamine peaks over and over and over and they aren't getting them, typically it's because they've been pursuing that activity far too often. With each repetition of a habit, small changes occur in the cognitive and neural mechanisms associated with procedural memory. Habits are things that our nervous system learned, but not always consciously. Sometimes we develop habits that we're not even aware of until they become a problem. Many people think that habits are just like reflexes, but pure reflexes are things like the eye blink reflex. Something comes toward your eye and you don't want it to get in your eye, you'll blink. Those aren't habits. Those are what we call hardwired reflexes. It's estimated that up to 70% of our waking behavior is made up of habitual behavior. We are very habitual, and we tend to do things more or less over and over in the same way unless we intervene in ourselves. That's just the way that we are wired. I mean, in theory, all the things that we're talking about with pornography, could be superimposed onto food or could be superimposed onto real sex, right? That one also has to be cautious there. There may be some nuance, but that there's sort of a core set of processes. The more time away from something, the more positively reinforcing it will be when you return. So the take-home message there is quite simple. Engage in, pursue quality, healthy social interactions. The underlying neurobiological mechanisms you now understand. So I hope both with the mechanisms that you now have in hand, plus some of the tools to tap into the dopaminergic system, that you'll feel that you have more control over your dopamine system,